This 1871 portrait of a dressmaker looks peaceful until you see the paper hidden under her hand. The woman sits composed, her fingers resting lightly on white linen. The photographer captured her as she wanted to be seen. But one detail in that image would not let go, and when a museum conservator finally understood what she was looking at, the entire portrait transformed from a simple trade photograph into evidence of a crime. Dr. Maya Hollins had worked at the Coastal Georgia Historical Society for 11 years. She specialized in 19th century photography, particularly portraits of black craftspeople and tradeswomen during Reconstruction. Most images that crossed her desk were straightforward: studio portraits, group photographs, documentation of businesses and churches. This one arrived in a cardboard tube, part of an estate donation from a family clearing out a house in the historic district of Savannah. The donor's note said only that the photo had been found in the attic, stored in a tin box alongside dress patterns and receipts from the 1870s. The photograph itself seemed ordinary at first. A young black woman, perhaps in her 20s, sits at a wooden sewing table positioned near a window. Natural light illuminates the left side of her face. She wears a dark dress with a high collar, her hair pulled back in a simple style. On the table in front of her, scissors, a spool of dark thread, a pincushion, and what appears to be a partly finished garment. Her right hand rests on a piece of paper, folded once, positioned beside the thread. Her expression is calm, dignified, the kind of image meant to show respectability and skill. Maya set the photograph on the light table in the conservation lab and switched on the high-intensity lamp. She was cataloging the image, noting the albumin print process, the cardboard backing, the studio mark barely visible in the lower corner. Then she adjusted the magnification and looked more closely at the paper under the woman's hand. The surface of the paper caught the light at an angle, and Maya could see something she had missed on first glance. There were marks on the paper, not writing exactly, but impressions, faint indentations, like someone had pressed down hard while writing on another sheet stacked on top of this one. The pressure had transferred through, leaving a reverse imprint. Maya increased the magnification and tilted the photograph under the lamp. She could make out individual letters now, pressed into the fiber. A name, maybe. A date. The marks were subtle, easy to dismiss as texture or aging, but they were there, deliberate, readable if you knew how to look. She sat back and stared at the image. This was not just a pretty old photo. Something here was wrong. Maya had spent over a decade working with photographs from this period. She had processed hundreds of images of freed people in the years immediately following emancipation. Trade portraits like this one were common. They served a purpose: proof of employment, evidence of skill, documentation for business records. Black women who worked as seamstresses, dressmakers, and laundresses often commissioned these photographs to demonstrate their legitimacy, to show clients they were professionals. The images were meant to project competence and respectability in a society that questioned both. But Maya had also learned to read what was not said in these pictures: the small signs of coercion, the stiffness that came from fear rather than formality. The objects placed deliberately in frame, not for aesthetics, but as evidence, proof, or warning. She pulled the photograph out of its archival sleeve and turned it over carefully. The back of the cardboard mount was unmarked except for a studio stamp: J. Wilson, photographer, Bull Street, Savannah, GA. Below that, in faint pencil, L.C. Sept, 1871, initials and a date. Maya photographed the back with her macro lens, then returned to the front of the image. She needed better resolution. She carried the photograph to the flatbed scanner and set the scan to 1200 dpi, high enough to capture the texture of the paper surface. While the machine worked, she thought about what those indentations might mean. A carbon copy? A letter pressed too hard? Or something else, something more deliberate? When the scan finished, she opened the file and zoomed in on the paper under the woman's hand. The indentations were clearer now on screen, readable when she inverted the colors and adjusted the contrast. Letters formed words. She could make out contract of employment, 12 months, penalties for breach. Her stomach tightened. She knew what this was. By the next morning, Maya had pulled everything she could find on J. Wilson's photography studio. City directories from 1870 and 1871 listed James Wilson at 48 Bull Street, occupation photographer. The studio operated from 1869 to 1874, then vanished from the records. Newspaper advertisements from the Savannah Morning News showed Wilson offered portraits of the colored population alongside standard studio work. His rates were listed as reasonable, and one advertisement noted that employment portraits were available for tradespeople at reduced cost. Maya also found 3 other photographs stamped with Wilson's mark in the Historical Society's collection. All depicted black workers, a carpenter, a washerwoman, a man identified as a porter. Each image included tools of the trade prominently displayed. None showed papers like the one in this photograph. She called Dr. Elijah Samuels, a historian at Georgia State who specialized in Reconstruction labor systems. They had worked together before on an exhibition about Savannah's black churches during Reconstruction. When she described what she had found, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you send me a high-resolution scan? I need to see the text on that paper." She sent the file. 20 minutes later, her phone rang. Elijah's voice was tight. "Maya, that's a labor contract. I can see enough of the imprint to recognize the language. This is black code enforcement, post-war peonage. Do you know who the woman is?" The initials on the back are LC September 1871. "We need to find her name, because if I'm right, someone made her pose for this photograph holding the evidence of her own coercion." The first record Maya found was in the 1870 census. Savannah, Chatham County, Georgia. Enumerated in August of that year, Laura Carver, black female, age 22, occupation listed as seamstress, living as a boarder in a household on West Broad Street. The household head was listed as Amelia Townsend, a black woman who ran a boarding house for working women. Laura Carver appeared again in the city directory for 1871, listed under dressmakers and seamstresses, colored. Her address matched the boarding house, but then the trail went cold. No entry for her in the 1872 directory, no census record in 1880 under that name in Savannah or the surrounding counties. Maya searched marriage records, thinking she might have changed her name, but found nothing. She checked death records for the city between 1871 and 1875. No Laura Carver. It was as if she had simply disappeared. Elijah arrived at the Historical Society 2 days later with a briefcase full of documents. He spread them across the table in the reading room. Photocopies of Georgia's Black Code statutes from 1866, labor contract templates used by the Freedmen's Bureau, and a thick file of contracts and indenture agreements from Chatham County dated between 1868 and 1873. After the war, he said, Georgia passed a series of laws supposedly to regulate labor and vagrancy. The Black Codes. Officially, they applied to everyone. In reality, they targeted freed people. If you were black and unemployed, or if you couldn't produce a valid labor contract on demand, you could be arrested for vagrancy. The penalty was a fine you couldn't pay, which meant you'd be hired out to a plantation owner or businessman to work off the debt. Forced labor, but legal. He pulled out a contract template. The language was formal, bureaucratic. I, the undersigned, do hereby contract my labor for a period of 12 months to, followed by blank spaces for names, dates, and terms. At the bottom, penalties for breach of contract, including fines and arrest. These contracts were everywhere, Elijah continued. Plantation owners would approach freedwomen and freedmen, especially those working independently as tradespeople, and pressure them to sign. Sometimes they'd offer what sounded like fair terms. Sometimes they'd just threaten arrest. The local authorities were complicit. If you refused to sign, you'd be picked up on a vagrancy charge within days. Maya looked at the photograph again, at Laura's hand resting on that folded paper. So this could be one of those contracts. Not just could be. Look at the visible text on the imprint. That phrasing, penalties for breach. That's straight from the template language. And if she's holding it in a photograph in September 1871, I'd guess someone made her document the contract as proof, either as leverage or as humiliation, maybe both. Who would force her to do that? Elijah leafed through his files. Let me show you something. He pulled out a ledger sheet, photocopied from the Chatham County Courthouse archives. This is from the records of the Freedmen's Bureau office in Savannah, 1870 to 1872. The Bureau was supposed to help freed people navigate contracts and employment disputes. But by 1870, most Bureau agents were sympathetic to the planters, and they started enforcing contracts that were essentially slavery by another name. Look at the entries for September 1871. Maya leaned over the ledger, Rows of names, dates, and brief notes. Halfway down the page, Laura Carver, seamstress, contract dispute with A.R. Mercer, resolved in favor of employer. Subject bound to terms for 12 months or penalty of $50 fine. A.R. Mercer, Maya said. Who is that? Elijah pulled out another document, a property record from 1872. Albert Raymond Mercer owned a cotton brokerage in Savannah and a plantation about 15 miles west of the city. After the war, he tried to restart operations using contracted labor. He also owned a building on Broughton Street that he rented out to tradespeople. Seamstresses, tailors, small businesses. I found a reference to him in a newspaper article from 1869, where he's quoted complaining about unreliable laborers and the need for stronger enforcement of contracts. So Laura Carver worked for him? Or he claimed she did. These disputes were often manufactured. A planter or businessman would produce a contract, real or forged, and claim the person owed labor. If the freed person couldn't prove otherwise, the Freedmen's Bureau or local court would side with the employer. The person would be forced to work off the supposed debt, and any attempt to leave would be treated as a crime. Maya stared at the photograph, Laura Carver's calm expression, her hand on the paper. This wasn't just documentation of her trade. This was documentation of her entrapment, Elijah nodded, and someone wanted a record of it. The plantation site was still there, 15 miles west of Savannah on a road that cut through flat fields and stretches of pine forest. Maya and Elijah drove out on a Saturday morning in late October. The land had changed hands multiple times since the 1870s. The main house was gone, torn down decades ago, but the property records showed the original boundaries. What remained now was farmland, a few outbuildings in various states of collapse, and a small cemetery enclosed by a rusted iron fence. They parked at the edge of the property and walked the perimeter. Maya had brought a copy of an 1872 plat map that showed the layout of the plantation. Fields, quarters, the main house, a barn. Elijah pointed to a spot near the tree line. That's where the workers' cabins would have been. After the war, some freed people stayed and worked the land as sharecroppers or contract laborers. Others left as soon as they could. They walked to the cemetery. Most of the headstones were simple, worn by time. A few had names and dates still legible. Maya photographed them all. Near the back corner, she found a marker that read only LC's 1849 to 1872. No full name, no epitaph. Could be her, Elijah said quietly. The dates match. Born around 1849, died in 1872, 1 year after that contract dispute. How did she die? We'd need to find a death certificate or coroner's report, but given the circumstances, it might not exist. A lot of deaths among contract laborers went unrecorded. Officially, they were accidents or illnesses. Unofficially, people worked to death or beaten for trying to leave. Maya knelt beside the marker. The stone was simple, local granite, the kind placed by family or community rather than a plantation owner. Someone had cared enough to mark her grave, but not enough to give her a full name. Or maybe they had been afraid to. Back in Savannah, Maya dug deeper into the Freedmen's Bureau records and county court files. She found more entries related to A.R. Mercer, dozens of contract disputes filed between 1869 and 1873. Almost all of them were resolved in his favor. The pattern was unmistakable. Mercer would claim a worker owed him labor, produce a contract, and the bureau agent or judge would enforce it. The workers had no legal representation and little recourse. She also found a letter, filed with the Bureau in October 1871, written by a group of freedwomen in Savannah. The letter, signed with several names and marked with X's, complained about coerced contracts and forged signatures. One passage stood out. We are told we must sign papers or face arrest. Some of us cannot read what the papers say. We are made to work with no pay, told the pay goes to debts we do not owe. This is slavery by another name. The letter was marked, received and filed, no action taken. Maya contacted Dr. Renee Cartwright, a legal historian at Emory who studied Reconstruction-era contract law. Over the phone, Renee explained the mechanics of the system. Black codes created a legal framework for forced labor. The contracts were often written in ways that guaranteed the worker would breach terms. Late one day, that's a breach. Leave the premises without permission, Breach, refuse an order, breach. Each breach came with fines the worker couldn't pay, which extended the contract or led to arrest and convict labor. What about forgery? Maya asked. Could these contracts be signed under duress or faked entirely? Absolutely. There are documented cases of plantation owners or labor agents forging signatures, especially if the worker was illiterate. The agents would claim the worker agreed verbally, then produce a signed document later. And because black testimony wasn't trusted in courts, the worker had no way to contest it. So if Laura Carver was photographed holding a contract in September 1871, right after a dispute was resolved in Mercer's favor, then that photograph was likely made to prove she had accepted the terms, visual evidence to back up the paperwork. It also served as intimidation, a reminder that she was bound. Maya felt the weight of it. This wasn't just a portrait of a dressmaker. It was a document of coercion, staged and preserved. She returned to the photograph and studied it again under magnification. Laura's expression wasn't calm. It was controlled, held. There was something in her eyes, a careful blankness, the look of someone who knows they are being watched and judged. Her hand on the paper was positioned deliberately, fingers splayed just enough to cover most of the text while revealing the shape of a folded document. Proof without detail, evidence without confession. And then Maya noticed something else. Laura's other hand, her left hand, rested in her lap, partly obscured by the table edge. But the fingers were not relaxed. They were pressed together, tips touching in a way that looked almost like a gesture. Maya zoomed in. The thumb and first two fingers formed a small, tight shape. She called Elijah. There's another detail, her left hand. Does that gesture mean anything to you? He asked her to send a close-up. 10 minutes later, he called back. I think that's a signal. There were communication systems among freed people, especially women, that used hand positions and small objects to convey status or warnings. Enslaved communities had used them before the war, and some carried over into Reconstruction. A particular way of folding hands or holding an object could indicate danger, distrust, or a call for help. I'd need to check with someone who specializes in material culture and resistance networks, but that hand position looks deliberate. Maya contacted Dr. Sharon Vincent, a professor at Spelman College, who researched coded communication among black women during and after slavery. Sharon drove down to Savannah the following week. When Maya showed her the photograph, Sharon studied it for a long time without speaking. Finally, she pointed to Laura's left hand. That's a recognition signal, Sharon said. It was used in some communities to identify someone under duress. If a woman was being held against her will or forced into a situation she couldn't refuse publicly, she might use a hand position like this in a photograph or public appearance. Other women who saw it would understand. It was a way of saying, I am not here by choice, I need help. These signals were passed down, taught quietly, mother to daughter, friend to friend. They were part of the survival network. Would everyone have known the meaning? Not everyone. Just those connected to the network, church groups, benevolent societies, mutual aid organizations, women looking out for each other in a world where they had no legal protection. Sharon pulled out a notebook and sketched the hand position. I've seen this one before in accounts from Savannah and Charleston. It shows up in a few other photographs from the 1860s and 1870s. Always women, always in situations that later turned out to involve coercion or violence. The signal didn't save anyone, not directly, but it created a record. When someone disappeared or turned up dead, the community would remember. They'd know it wasn't an accident. Maya felt a chill. So Laura was signaling she was in trouble. She was signaling she was not free. Even in a photograph meant to show her as a respectable tradeswoman, she found a way to tell the truth. The broader system came into focus. Maya and Elijah spent weeks pulling records from multiple archives, county court files, Freedmen's Bureau reports, church membership rolls, burial society records, and newspapers. The pattern was clear and widespread. Between 1868 and 1875, over 300 contract disputes were filed in Chatham County alone. Almost all involved black workers and white employers. Almost all were resolved in favor of the employer. The contracts themselves varied in language, but they shared common features: long terms, harsh penalties for breach, vague definitions of satisfactory labor, and clauses that allowed the employer to extend the contract for any perceived debt or infraction. Women were particularly vulnerable. Seamstresses, laundresses, and domestic workers were targeted because their labor was portable and valuable. A skilled dressmaker like Laura Carver could be forced into a contract that bound her to a specific household or business for a year or more, her wages held as payment for supposed room and board or past debts. If she tried to leave or work independently, she'd be arrested for breach of contract or vagrancy. The Freedmen's Bureau, which had been established to protect formerly enslaved people, became an enforcement arm of this system by the early 1870s. Agents were overwhelmed, underfunded, and often sympathetic to white employers. They treated contract disputes as civil matters, not recognizing or refusing to acknowledge the coercion behind them. Maya found a particularly damning document in the Georgia State Archives, a report from a bureau agent in Savannah, dated November 1871, 2 months after Laura's photograph. The agent wrote, "The colored population continues to resist long-term employment contracts, claiming they are treated as slaves. I have explained repeatedly that contracts are legal and binding under the law, and that refusal to honor them will result in criminal penalties. Several individuals have been remanded to labor under court order. The system functions as intended." The phrase "remanded to labor" was a euphemism. It meant forced work, often on the same plantations where people had been enslaved, under conditions barely distinguishable from slavery itself. Elijah found records showing that A.R. Mercer had employed at least 15 contracted workers between 1869 and 1873. 5 were women, all listed as seamstresses or laundresses. 3 of those women appeared in court records for contract disputes. 2, including Laura Carver, disappeared from public records within 2 years of the dispute. Mercer wasn't unusual, Elijah said. He was typical. Hundreds of men like him across Georgia and the rest of the South used these laws to rebuild their labor force. It was legal, it was systematic, and it was designed to look respectable on paper. The photograph took on new meaning. It wasn't documentation of Laura's skill or independence. It was documentation of her captivity, staged by someone who wanted proof she had accepted her bondage. The paper under her hand, with its faint imprint of contract language, was evidence of a crime disguised as lawful employment, and her hand signal, hidden in plain sight, was her only act of resistance. Maya knew she had to do something with this. The photograph couldn't remain just another item in the collection, cataloged and stored. But she also knew that what she was about to propose would not be welcomed by everyone. The Coastal Georgia Historical Society was governed by a board of directors, most of them descendants of old Savannah families. The society's funding came from a mix of memberships, donations, and a modest endowment. Several major donors had family connections to the city's antebellum elite. They prided themselves on preserving Savannah's heritage, which they often framed as a story of genteel architecture, historic gardens, and wartime resilience. Maya scheduled a presentation for the December board meeting. She prepared carefully, printing copies of the photograph, the census records, the contract dispute entry, and the Freedmen's Bureau reports. She invited Elijah, Sharon, and Renee to attend as expert witnesses. The meeting was held in the Society's main building, a renovated townhouse on East Jones Street. 12 board members sat around a long table. The director, Margaret Preston, an older white woman who had run the society for 2 decades, opened the meeting and turned the floor over to Maya. Maya started with the photograph. She explained how it had arrived, what she had noticed, and what her research had uncovered. She showed the magnified image of the paper's indentations, the contract language, the court records. She explained the black codes, the forced labor system, and the pattern of coercion targeting freedwomen in Savannah during Reconstruction. Then she showed Laura's hand signal and explained its meaning. "This photograph," Maya said, "is not a portrait of a dressmaker. It's evidence of a crime. It documents the legal enslavement of a free woman through coerced contracts, and it shows her attempt to resist, to leave a signal for others who might understand." The room was quiet. Margaret folded her hands on the table. "That's quite a theory, Dr. Hollins." "It's not a theory," Maya said. She documented. The court records, the bureau files, the contracts, they all support this interpretation." One of the board members, a man in his 60s named Robert Caldwell, spoke up. "With all due respect, you're making assumptions about a single photograph. You've identified the woman, yes, and you found a court entry that suggests she was in a contract dispute, but you don't have proof that the paper in this photograph is the contract or that she was coerced. It could just as easily be an ordinary employment photograph. Elijah leaned forward. Mr. Caldwell, the pattern is clear. Over 300 cases like this in Chatham County alone, all resolved in favor of employers. The legal historians I've consulted agree that these contracts were used to circumvent emancipation. This isn't speculation. It's well-established history. Robert shook his head. Established by whom? Academics with a particular agenda? I'm not saying there weren't labor disputes after the war, but calling this slavery is inflammatory. These were contracts, legal agreements. Freed people signed them voluntarily. Sharon spoke, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Caldwell, if you sign a contract because you've been threatened with arrest, or because you're illiterate and don't understand the terms, or because the alternative is starvation, is that voluntary? That's a philosophical question. No, Sharon said. It's a legal and historical fact. Coercion invalidates consent, and the evidence shows these contracts were coercive. Margaret raised a hand. Let's not turn this into a debate. Dr. Hollins, what exactly are you proposing we do with this photograph? Maya took a breath. I'm proposing we feature it in a new exhibition on Reconstruction labor practices in Savannah. We'd tell Laura Carver's story, explain the black codes, and use the photograph as the centerpiece. We'd also include other examples of coerced contracts and resistance networks. The point is to show how legal systems were used to re-enslave freed people after emancipation. Another board member, a woman named Jennifer Hayes, frowned. Maya, I appreciate your research, but I'm concerned about how this would be received. We have donors who trace their families back to this period. This kind of exhibition could be seen as accusatory. Accusatory of what? Maya asked. Of historical fact? Of their ancestors. You're essentially saying that prominent Savannah families participated in forced labor. I'm saying some did, because they did. The records prove it. Robert leaned back in his chair. And you think this is what our members want to see when they visit? They come here for history, not politics. This is history, Maya said, and ignoring it is a political choice. The meeting went on for another hour. Margaret suggested that Maya prepare a more detailed proposal with a budget and exhibition plan. She didn't shut down the idea entirely, but she made it clear that the board would need time to consider the implications. Several members voiced concerns about controversy, about alienating donors, about the difficulty of presenting contested historical interpretations. Maya left the meeting frustrated but not surprised. She had known this would be difficult. Institutions that prided themselves on preserving heritage often resisted narratives that complicated or contradicted their founding myths. But she wasn't alone. Elijah, Sharon, and Renee stayed with her after the meeting. They talked in the parking lot, leaning against cars as dusk settled over the historic district. They'll come around, Elijah said, or you'll find another way to get this story out. I'm not waiting for them to decide, Maya said. If the society won't do it, I'll publish the research independently, find a journal or a magazine that will run it. Sharon nodded. There are also descendant communities you should reach out to. If Laura Carver had family, they might still be in the area, or connected through churches and burial societies. They'd want to know what happened to her. Maya thought about the cemetery marker, LC 1849 to 1872. Someone had cared enough to bury her and mark the grave. Someone remembered. Over the next 2 months, Maya did exactly what she had promised. She wrote an article detailing her findings and submitted it to the Journal of Southern History. She also reached out to local black churches and genealogical societies in Savannah, asking if anyone had records or oral histories related to Laura Carver or the Townsend boarding house. In early February, she received a response from a woman named Joyce Mitchell. Joyce was a retired schoolteacher and member of First African Baptist Church, one of the oldest black congregations in Savannah. She had seen Maya's inquiry through the church's Historical Preservation Committee. My great-great-grandmother knew Laura Carver, Joyce wrote. They were part of the same Women's Aid Society. I have a few letters in a diary that mention her. I'd like to meet with you. They met at the church, a solid brick building on Franklin Square with a history stretching back to the 1770s. Joyce brought a small cardboard box containing family papers. Inside were letters, receipts, and a slim, leather-bound diary. "This belonged to my great-great-grandmother, Clara Mitchell," Joyce said. "She was a laundress and a member of the Women's Benevolent Society here at the church. They helped each other with everything: childcare, loans, legal advice, protection. If a woman was in trouble, the society would try to help." Maya opened the diary carefully. The entries were brief, dated between 1870 and 1875. She found Laura's name on a page dated October 1871. "LC came to meeting tonight. She is in distress, bound to a contract she did not agree to. We advised her to speak to Brother Samuels, who knows the law, but she says the freedman's man will not listen. She is afraid. We told her we will watch for her and pray." A later entry dated December 1871. "LC has not come to meeting in 2 months. Heard she is working on Mercer's place. Some say she tried to leave and was brought back by the sheriff. We do not know how to help her." And then, April 1872. "Sad news. LC passed. Sickness, they say, but we all know the truth. Sister Townsend arranged for burial. We put her in the cemetery with others. God rest her." Maya's hands shook as she read. Joyce watched her quietly. "They knew," Maya said. "Her community knew she was being held against her will." "Of course they knew," Joyce said. "But what could they do? Challenge the courts, the police? They'd be arrested themselves. So they did what they could. They remembered her. They buried her properly, and they wrote it down." Joyce pulled out another page, a list of names written in careful script. "This is the membership roll of the Benevolent Society from 1871, 43 women. Some of these names are in my family. Some are in other families here in Savannah. Descendants are still around. If you're telling Laura's story, you should know she wasn't alone. None of these women were." The article was published in the spring. It included the photograph, the archival records, and excerpts from Clara Mitchell's diary. Maya titled it "Portrait of Bondage, Coerced Labor Contracts and Visual Evidence in Reconstruction Savannah." The response was immediate. Academic journals and history blogs picked it up. News outlets in Savannah and Atlanta ran features. The photograph circulated online, with people zooming in on the indentations and the hand signal, seeing for the first time what had been hidden in plain sight for over 150 years. The Historical Society, under pressure from the attention and after consultation with its board, agreed to mount an exhibition. Margaret called Maya in June and asked if she'd be willing to curate it. Maya agreed, with one condition: the descendant community would be involved in every stage. The exhibition opened in October, exactly 1 year after Maya first saw the photograph. It was titled "Bound by Law, Black Codes and Coerced Labor in Reconstruction, Georgia." Laura Carver's portrait was the centerpiece, displayed alongside her court records, the contract templates, the diary entries, and photographs of the cemetery marker. Joyce Mitchell and other descendants of the Benevolent Society members spoke at the opening. They shared stories passed down through their families, stories of women who survived the contract system and women who did not. They talked about resistance, about the ways their ancestors found to help each other when the law offered no protection. One of the most powerful moments came when a woman named Evelyn Carver stepped forward. She was in her 70s, a retired nurse, and she identified herself as a distant relative of Laura Carver. "I didn't know this part of her story," Evelyn said. "My family knew she'd been a seamstress in Savannah and that she died young, but we didn't know the circumstances. We didn't know she'd been trapped by these contracts, or that she'd left a signal in that photograph. Now I understand why no one in my family ever talked much about this time period. The pain was too deep. But I'm grateful someone finally looked closely enough to see what she was trying to say." The exhibition ran for 6 months. It drew thousands of visitors, including school groups, scholars, and families. Some visitors left comments in the guest book. Many expressed shock at learning about the contract system. Some wrote that they'd never heard this history taught in school. Others, mostly black visitors, wrote that they'd always known, their families had told them, and it was about time institutions acknowledged it publicly. The exhibition also sparked criticism. A few opinion pieces in local papers accused the Historical Society of rewriting history or promoting a divisive narrative. One letter to the editor called the exhibition an attack on Savannah's heritage. But the Historical Society stood by the work, and Margaret, to her credit, defended it in a public statement. Our mission is to preserve and present history honestly. That includes the uncomfortable parts. Maya worked with the society to digitize the photograph and make it freely available online, along with all the supporting documents. She wanted teachers, researchers, and anyone interested to be able to access the materials without barriers. The photograph and its story became part of the teaching curriculum in several Georgia schools. More than that, the project opened up new lines of research. Other historians began looking more closely at trade portraits from the Reconstruction era, searching for similar signals and hidden details. They found them. Photographs of laundresses, tailors, and craftspeople, all taken in studios, all including small objects or hand positions that, when examined closely, revealed stories of coercion and resistance. Maya realized that these photographs had been evidence all along. They had been waiting in archives and attics and museum collections for someone to look closely enough, to ask the right questions, to understand what the people in the images were trying to say. Every photograph has a surface story and a hidden one. The surface is what the photographer and subject wanted the viewer to see, the respectable image, the proof of skill or status or citizenship. But the hidden story is often more truthful. It's in the details. The hand positions, the objects, the expressions held too carefully, the papers folded just so. Laura Carver sat for that portrait in September 1871, forced to document her own entrapment. She placed her hand on a contract she likely could not refuse, a piece of paper that legally bound her to labor she did not choose. She did what she was told. She sat still. She looked into the camera. But she also left a signal, a small defiant gesture with her left hand, a message for anyone who knew how to read it. She was saying, "Even then, I'm not here by choice. I'm not free. Remember me." And now, more than 150 years later, people do remember. They see the photograph not as a portrait of a dressmaker, but as evidence of a system that used law and paperwork to re-enslave thousands of people after emancipation. They understand that Reconstruction was not just a period of rebuilding, but also a period of new forms of violence and exploitation disguised as legality. Laura's photograph is not unique. There are thousands of images like it, stored in archives and family collections across the South, portraits that seem ordinary, peaceful, respectable. But in many of them, if you look closely, you'll find the small signs of resistance and distress. The hidden papers, the strange hand positions, the objects that don't quite fit. These images were made to show one thing and ended up showing another. They are evidence of crimes that were once legal, of suffering that was once justified, and of people who found ways to leave traces of the truth even when they couldn't speak it aloud. The next time you see an old photograph, look closer. Ask who wanted the image made and why. Ask what the person in the frame might have wanted to say but couldn't. Because every portrait contains more than what the camera captured. Every image is a fragment of a larger story, waiting for someone patient enough to read between the lines.